Hey friends, we have a couple of announcements before we get started. First, did you see Nat's article on Autostraddle? It's about queer prepping, and Kalyan's in it, along with a whole bunch of other amazing queer people, and it's beautiful. Please go see. Also, Queers at the End of the World has started a Patreon. If you enjoy the podcast and you want to support it and help us pay contributors, and also you want access to awesome extra conversations and outtakes and collaborative AI poetry, come on over and join up. And if you like supporting queer art making, but you hate presence and publicity, it's not everyone's love language, I know. You can also become a monthly supporter on Anchor. That's Queers at the End of the World on Anchor.fm. Okay, last thing. We're starting a new feature to bring you recommendations on media made by other queer and trans folks. It's going to be running once a month between our longer episodes. It's called Queers at the End of the World Presents, and we rip that title off from Transcripts, which is a great podcast presenting trans-made audio that you should 100% check out. Okay, that's it. Let's get to the show.
I was stirred by the dark mystery of mortality. I couldn't resist stealing up to the edge of doom and peering over the brink. The hint of what was concealed in those shadows terrified me, but I caught sight of something in the glimpse, some forbidden and elemental riddle that was no less compelling than the sweet, hidden petals of a woman's sex.
Nat, I feel like pretty early on in that book, I knew deep in my heart that I was not going to get through the whole thing without hearing something compared to labia.
Labia lurking behind every rough outcropping and stark burbling Colorado River. They're there.
Rising from the burbles, peering from behind the trees. This is Queers at the End of the World, the podcast where an insane, all-powerful AI is forcing the world's leaders to listen to her talk about her feelings, and we're all a whole lot better for it. I'm your host, Nina.
And I'm your host, Nat.
And today we're going to talk about Into the Wild.
Dude, it's really fun to me that we kind of set off on this journey with My Side of the Mountain as the centerpiece and Hatchet, and then we got so obsessed with this book.
Yeah. I mean, partly because it's a real story. The book is about this kid, Christopher McCandless. And I'm hesitating on his name because throughout much of the book, he calls himself Alexander Supertramp. And
dude, side note, that's awesome and the most self-aggrandizing thing I've ever heard.
I know. And I just feel that way about this character the whole time. I just go back and forth on him because I'm so self-aggrandizing, so annoying. I am trained to find this person endearing by everything in my culture. And
yeah.
Therefore, some of my sympathy is manufactured by that. But at the same time, I feel like I could like a dude named Alexander Supertramp.
Dude, I feel like I want to be called Alexander Supertramp. 100% strong desire. I always feel like there's a certain type of narcissistic, flamboyant masculinity that if it's genderqueer, it's suddenly awesome. But then if it's a cis guy doing it, it seems like a total asshole. And that name feels like an outfit I could put on that's toxic masculinity clothing, but on me, people would be queer excellence. It's literally a drag king name. I can totally see, a switch and play king named Alexander Supertramp, performing in Brooklyn.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of cosplaying toxic masculinity, we were, I will say, a little bit ambivalent about airing this episode right now, because, who needs another white guy's take on another white guy when 1,000 white guys just stormed the Capitol a week ago and now they're coming to a Capitol near you? We're all kind of dealing with a lot of intense feelings and fears and all of this right now. But at the same time, I think both of us kind of found a bit of a place for this story in the context of this present moment.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, partly because we just kind of had a really great time reading and talking about this book. I mean, it's such an absurd book. And honestly, And the way we're kind of laughing about it is, I think a recognition of that level of absurdity in this like appreciation of this like mythological creature that is the perfect masculine survivalist.
Yeah,
And, I think we do see a connection between all these various white men with guns screaming freedom. We said Hatchet and My Side of the Mountain were connected to the kinds of survival we talk about on this show. And that survivalist is also the creature at the center of our ongoing, very real, and very present apocalypse. This apocalypse, like the one we are living in with a legacy of genocide, slavery, and conquest every day.
absolutely.
So let's dive in and we'll get started with the plot of Into the Wild.
Okay, so another little bit of context. I think one of the reasons why I wanted to look at this book in the first place is kind of fueled by the rage of my wife, who hated this movie with a passion that I have never seen her feel about any other piece of media before. And we've kind of been talking about it off and on ever since. So a lot of the thinking that I did kind of leading up to this episode and enabling us to talk about it comes out of conversations with her. So I just wanted to acknowledge her at the start.
Yeah.
So, Into the Wild by John Krakauer. It's based off of a feature article that John Krakauer wrote for Outdoor Magazine. And the article is about this kid named Christopher McCandless, aka Alexander Supertramp, who died while trying to survive alone in the Alaskan wilderness. And he'd been trying to survive off of nothing but his gun and a 10-pound bag of rice. And I think we were really interested in this because it's a real life application of exactly the same themes and motivations that we see in both of the YA stories that we've been talking about. And actually, I would say that McCandless kind of counts to some extent as a boy in the woods, even though he was I think he was around 24 when he died.
Yeah, I mean, I would say definitely the book. And I think also the movies sort of treat him like this spirit of eternal youth.
Yeah. And of course, that's like a thing with white men, right? Like getting treated as innocents well into their adulthood. And I think there's something really central about that to the way that McCandless is actually received by other people all throughout the book. So he grew up in Alexandria in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and he really, really didn't get along with his family, especially his father. He's obsessed with Tolstoy and Jack London and all these guys who advocate for freedom and individualism and self-reliance. And his dad is kind of an establishment guy who wants him to go to law school and settle down. And so after college, he takes off to hitchhike around the continent, first in his car and then on foot. And he does this for 2 years, moving from place to place. He's what he calls a leather tramp, which is less sexy than it sounds and just means he gets around on foot instead of by car. And eventually he gets this idea to go and try and survive out in the wilderness in Alaska. So he gets there in April of 1992 and he takes barely anything with him, just rice and a sleeping bag and a gun and a lot of early 20th century Russian literature. And then he lives there for several months until something happens. And Krakauer thinks what happened, I think we touched on this already, but he thinks that he accidentally got alkaline poisoning from eating the wrong kind of wild edibles. And then by September of that same year, he's starved to death. And he's found by a group of hikers and hunters. And Krakauer writes this article about it. And there's a huge backlash with a lot of folks calling it a tragedy and even more people being like, that kid was just a hubristic idiot. And Krakauer definitely falls in line with the tragedy camp. But the thing that I think really drew me to this book and made me want to spend this episode talking about it is really Krakauer. I want to talk about McCandless too, but I think it's how intensely Krakauer is just trying to jam and fold and force McCandless into this mold of masculine wilderness mythology.
Yeah, I just think we need to read a few of these lines out loud because it's hard to get this across otherwise. Now, keep in mind, even Krakauer admits McCandless was not a deeply sexual person. And yet, this is how Krakauer talks about literally a bunch of irrigation ditches. Emasculated by dams and diversion canals, the lower Colorado burbles indolently from reservoir to reservoir through some of the hottest, starkest country on the continent.
Yeah. And here's Krakauer trying to explain away why no one he talked to can ever remember McCandless having a girlfriend after high school. Like not a few of those seduced by the wild, McCandless seems to have been driven by a variety of lust that supplanted sexual desire. His yearning, in a sense, was too powerful to be quenched by human contact. McCandless may have been tempted by the succor offered by women, but it paled beside the prospect of rough congress with nature, with the cosmos itself. Yeah. I mean, you gotta hand it to toxic masculinity. Like, because at least sometimes it just like gets so intense with the internalized homophobia that it like inverts on itself and you end up with like cosmic assholes, like the fact that all galaxies are just giant floating space anuses.
We need to have like a little thing where it's like space anus, and then that's like the sound effect, and it kind of echoes like it's like cosmic.
Oh, like this. Space anus.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we keep getting distracted by puerile delights. But this book is so invested in ramming this child into the mold of like the like perfect masculine vessel that like Krakauer I really feel like is completely obsessed with making this person over and making them out to be like the perfect competent. It sort of pretends that he's like extremely special and like this perfect special man, and then at the same time like so much of his specialness, to me feel is like basically like he's highly educated, white and male and young and able bodied, like he has like of course people are drawn to him and attracted to him and help him all the time.
Seriously, it's like this attribution of specialness and um guile and charm and depth, um uh, that's the explanation for why he's able to kind of gallivant around the country hitchhiking and sort of being a vagabond and doing all of these random little um manual labor jobs and hanging out with different kinds of people who have all kinds of different sort of life circumstances.
Who just like give him stuff,
Yeah,
like just
people are
shower
like,
him.
"Can I adopt you as my grandson?" And he's like, "No, like, I don't want that." And you're just like, "Jesus." Like,
Like, at least let me drive you hours and hours.
well, I mean, there's one quote in there where he talks about, um, McCandless getting, thrown in jail at the border, I think, between Mexico and the United States, and I think the language that he concocted a story that sprung him from the slammer,
Yep.
uh, Krakauer writes, um caught by immigration authorities trying to slip into the country without ID. He spent a night in custody before concocting a story that sprang him from the slammer, minus his 38 caliber handgun, a beautiful Colt Python to which he was much attached.
I mean, if you're not attached to your python, what kind of man are you? So,
I mean, I feel like there's mythologizing like he talked his way out of jail
right.
due to his immense like special charm, and it's like, is it special charm or is it the fact that he's like cis white male who obviously looks educated and probably mentioned the fact that he has parents who live and work in Washington DC and have political influence, like what is it that got him out of jail in this situation?
Yeah, I mean that just reminds me of like the points at which I began to understand that like not everybody got out of speeding tickets the way that I did throughout my entire youth because I was read as like a white girl by these cops. I was, I like never got a ticket in my life. And I remember having that conversation with friends of color who were like, no, that does not happen to me. Like, and so I feel like John Krakauer sees himself anyway as so close to the experience of McCandless that like that never occurs to him that like McCandless's story that springs him from the slammer is not like a special thing. It's like, no, you're a white boy. Like that's how that works.
I know, it's deeply provoking. I mean, the whole book is just a really frustrating look at this myth making around wilderness masculinity. Because of how short-sighted it is about the level of privilege involved in basically everything this, essentially random person did. Like, you know, the amount of focus on him is like creating this idea that he's like this unique, special, interesting um, person worth studying, which honestly, that's not true. And it also is true because most people are deep and interesting and worth studying. And the iconifying him as somehow unique is really frustrating because it's like there's just so many aspects to it. It's like, what was he in search of? What made him so special that he was able to like talk his way across the country and hitchhike and be free and sort of have this attitude of like, well, everything will just work out. And, honestly, that is something I observe a lot in cis men, which is this sort of hand waving kind of thing of like, well, it'll work out.
Right.
I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not worried though, because like whatever happens when I get there or whenever I do whatever the next thing is, it'll work out, quote unquote. And you're like, what makes him so unique that he's able to like without stress just assume things are going to work out? What a charmer. And it's like, is the guy a charmer or is it just that like no matter where he fucking goes, everybody takes care of him all of the time? Like
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of like I don't know if you've ever read Studs Terkel's History of the Depression, Hard Times, but it's like an oral history of the Great Depression. And for a long time in the beginning of the book, the speakers are white. And there was this one that really particularly hit me because, it's this guy telling the story of riding the rails and getting caught and then put into a camp. And he's like, and then I got caught and I got put into a work camp and they paid me and I had like a bed to sleep in and I got fed 3 squared a day. And, like basically, I mean, I think there is compulsion there, if I remember correctly, but like basically he gets caught riding the rails and he gets given like a job in housing to probably simplify that a little bit. But like then like a little while later you read the story of like a black man who's riding the rails who gets caught, beaten within an inch of his life and put in jail. And it's just like it's just so stark. It's like a completely different experience of like what it means to be moving freely, quote unquote, in America.
Well, I mean, seriously. And it just, you saying that really makes me think about like this idea of the specialness of these types of men who get the notion that they want to go out and have an experience of nature. And there's this sort of like, overly passionate, even erotic examination of what is that spiritual impulse that like draws one to like commune with nature and have this like transcendent experience of wilderness. And it's just completely blind to the fact that what draws you to that is in part being able to do it in the first place and not limited by something that you have nothing to do with, but is exerting a force on every aspect of your life all of the time.
Right.
Like being black and, hitchhiking being an incredible amount of risk or riding the rails being an incredible amount of risk where it wouldn't be for someone doing that same thing who is white.
Or male. Yeah.
It just pisses me off because if there's one thing I hate, it's like the making special of a particular person is fraught to me. Like, I think I would be able to accept it more if Krakauer was more honest about why this person is special to him. But it's like it's sort of tried to like be done in a passive voice as though we all have already accepted the specialness of this kid.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of it being this relative thing that it's obviously special to him because he's basically the same person or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's actually pretty interesting because I don't agree that I feel like there's room to kind of like wedge apart Krakauer and McCandless. I feel like Krakauer really wants to be the same as McCandless and really like it is trying to make that identification as airtight as possible and trying to make sure that that identification then reflects back on him, Krakauer, the author, like a perfect masculinity that is not sullied by the fact that this person died in the wilderness. And like I do want to say like, Christopher McCandless died in 1992. He was 24. His family's still alive. Like, it's a little bit fraught to be talking about this nonfiction book but I feel like there is a like it's also important to be talking about this character because he is so constructed as like, there's a movie made of it, and like he's constructed as like either a hero or a dupe, or as like an idiot. And those are both to me kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Like either like Krakauer says McCandless is this perfect masculine object who never really did anything really seriously wrong. Like so much of the book is kind of spent on being like, people thought this was a mistake, but actually he was probably doing everything right. And it was just dumb luck and tragedy that he died. And there's like that. And then the other side of the coin is, well, if that idiot knew anything before he went into Alaska, like if he wasn't so full of hubris that, which he was full of hubris, but it doesn't, like, neither one lets you off the hook for recognizing that, like, he was a human person who, was like trying to make sense of his life with the tools that he had, and like you too, have these same driving desires, and like it's like everyone is kind of like trying to make him into either an example of the success or an example of the failure, to adapt to the same stupid toxic masculine stereotype, um where he's either like perfectly capable or perfectly incapable, and either way it's like, there's a perfect person that they're trying to make him be, and that's their own investment and not about him at all and the person that he was.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I really think you're right. Like, I think I'm sad about him merging with the sort of toxic masculinity myth. Like, we sort of saw that with Brian and Hatchet. Like, it's this flip back and forth between, emasculation and weakness and crying and despair, and then like intuitive, at one with nature, hatchet wielding, evolved, um, nature boy.
Right.
And there's no shades of gray between those two states. And, in the case of a real person, the thing that's so painful when you see that person's life story turned into that like two-sided coin is it completely eliminates the fact that that particular guy, Chris McCandless, from what I can tell from the story and Into the Wild, was trying to get outside of external narratives of what the right thing is to do in this life. And if he was searching for anything, he was trying not to be having his life dictated to him by other people's ideas of what the right thing is to do.
Yeah.
So to me, the most tragic aspect of it is, I mean, in addition to the fact that he died young, and it's absolutely a tragedy for his family and the people that were close to him who are mentioned in the book, it's a tragedy that his story became symbolic for people instead of being what it was, which I think he was like wanting his life to just be an adventure that had chaos and unpredictability and didn't have a larger symbolic meaning. Like he was the teenage Tolstoyan or whatever, which is, I think, one of the things Krakauer calls him in Into the Wild.
Sprang him from the slanger, that teenage Tolstoyan.
Some of the language in that book is pretty intense. I mean, from the lens of being queer, I mean, I certainly identify with the idea of like, wanting to leave structures that I would perceive as controlling my life. Like there's aspects in there where he's like, fuck capitalism, fuck money. I don't believe in having these things like dictate who I am. And it's like, that aspect of it seems really human and actually really fascinating to me.
Totally.
And there was an aspect of that involved an encounter with nature as well. And that's where it started to become like the nature boy myth, I guess.
Yeah, probably because, I mean, for a lot of reasons, including that he's a 24-year-old who comes from a wealthy family. Like, I've met that kid so many times. I've had so many eye-rolling conversations with that kid where they talked about, like, their pure ideals of like not living in capitalism and burning all their money, and and also like being great salesmen at their like local contractor shop, and like just like and how like one must renounce all of whatever in order to be the pure whatever. And it's just like I feel like in those conversations, I see my responsibility in those moments, like to puncture that narrative to a certain extent, and to like try and like bring some impurity into the world that they can imagine is good, because it is a total trap. And McCandless died there fundamentally. Like, I think I agree with you that there are some really appealing things about what he in his 24-year-old way was trying to get outside of. But he also was really attached to them. I think one of the things that really struck me at the beginning of the memoir, it's not a memoir either, at the beginning of the book, is when he describes McCandless hitchhiking into Alaska, and he like gets into a truck with this guy who drives him, most of the way to the place where he eventually dies. And the guy tries to give him a pair of rubber boots because he just sees this kid as like so unprepared. He doesn't have any of the necessary gear. So he's just like, at least take these boots, right? Which again, people caring for him. And McCandless asks how much he owes him. And that kind of thing happens over and over and over again, where McCandless refuses to take, gifts from people kind of arbitrarily. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. Very frequently, he kind of tries to pay the person back. And it's like a way, instead of being like, let's be in a mutual relationship, I will give you what you need, you will give me what I need, so that we can all be people who have what we need. It's like a transactional relationship where it's like, I will only take what I need from you if you will accept money from me, or even like the pretense that I would pay you. And that just feels like, he thinks he wants to get outside of this, but he's also still really trapped in that system of like self-sufficiency and independence, and instead of mutuality.
I mean, that's what's tragic about it is like I have a lot of sympathy for the desire to escape that. And it's tragic when you read a story of someone who has the impulse to get outside of um this system and has no way out. And then even has an experience of kind of having the wool pulled over their eyes as to what getting out is or means. And then
Yeah.
that being his whole life, right? It's like, I wish that there was somebody who could have communicated with him about the idea that there is no purity, there is no value clarity. Yeah, like the thing you were saying about like mutuality instead of transactionality, and just like these ways that you can start to get into this other intellectual and emotional space where you're not, looking at things through the lens of like either this or that. And I think for these types of boys that we've been reading, like there is no option for them to do that. They are trapped. And this is the only thing that they can think of that would give them any route to do anything else.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's part of what makes Into the Wild such a kind of important text to read in relation to Hatchet and My Side of the Mountain, because I think the boys in Hatchet and My Side of the Mountain are the kind of like, they're the boys that McCandless is being compared to when people talk about like, what is he, who should he have been? And I think they are the archetype that he's holding himself up against, although in his version it's Jack London and Thoreau, or anyway, in Krakauer's version of him, it's Jack London and Thoreau, and his idea, it's Tolstoy, right? Who are in fact people who are complicated, right? And I think Krakauer often reads them as like they're hypocrites because Jack London, didn't just like only went to Alaska for a week, and it's like this question of like, if you only went to Alaska for a week, then you're a hypocrite. But like maybe it's more like your system is broken. It's not that like you're a hypocrite for going there for a week. It's that like the whole idea of the only way you can prove that you're a man and is by like living in Alaska forever is like a broken thing.
Right.
And then what it comes down to is like, if the goal is to live in Alaska forever, then the goal is to die in Alaska, right? And that's why Christopher McCandless is sort of like this perfect space for Krakauer to project his fantasies of like what real wilderness masculinity looks like onto, because McCandless is dead. Like, McCandless went to Alaska. He lived there forever. Like, he lived there as long as he had left, and he died there. And that's sort of like the ultimate wilderness cred. And I think in a lot of ways this book feels like just watching this painful project of trying to insist that, you know, there's something really beautiful in dying for that broken system.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking about that just flipping through it to get those quotes and um the part at the end when he kind of is like saying Chris McCandless was at peace, serene as a monk gone to God.
Yeah.
To me, that's just that impulse that we have to kind of tie someone's life with a neat bow once they've passed away and have there be some kind of mythology of what the person was.
Mm.
And instead of just being able to accept that people are complicated, life is complicated, no human life adds up to one particular thing, and we can't know if he was at peace or not when he died. And I feel like it's much more of a spiritual move not to make assumptions about what was going through his head at that moment.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, it's interesting. I feel like it brings me to thinking about like the investment the book has in him being kind of intentionally celibate, and his celibacy as like connected to religious fervor. And I mean, it feels like it's kind of trying to rewrite him as, like, he's got that whole story about like the monks in, what is it, like Scandinavia somewhere, and like these monks in their coracles like fleeing from like a few people showing up because they're so celibate. And I mean, I feel like this book in a lot of ways is like a crash course in the binaries that are all part of masculine mythology, and they're, you know, they go beyond like male and female, good and bad, competent and incompetent, and like, you know, there's also like this idea of like continence and being able to hold things in yourself. And I think he needs to kind of make Chris McCandless's celibacy into this like self-confident, self-continent reservoir of power instead of like another complicated aspect of a person that he doesn't really understand or know.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of feels like he's interpreting it as something that McCandless had the agency to make a choice about instead of, the reality is that many things in life are outcomes of all kinds of circumstances and elements of a person's history. And I feel like relationships and the way you relate with sex is absolutely in that category. Like, who knows what his attitude or towards sex was or relationship with it was.
Hmm.
But it's certainly not just like clear to me that he was just making this decision to be a monk.
Yeah, but it's so important to Krakauer that that be explained. You know, he's got like these paragraphs on like McCandless's sexuality where he's like, yeah, he didn't have sex with women, he didn't have sex with men, he didn't seem to have sex with anybody. You know, I feel like there's a way that that threatens. I mean, clearly that's threatening to the idea of McCandless as this sort of like powerful alpha male guy who is great at everything, and that I think Krakauer really wants to construct, because he, you know, as he says in the beginning, he relates very much to McCandless, and I think it would be scary for him because he's the type of guy who sees vaginas in ice sculptures. It would be really, which I'm that type of guy too, I guess, but maybe just not so on the nose about it. um Anyway, I don't know. Yeah, just that it's really, I think it's really threatening to him for McCandless to be celibate, and so he has to like bring it back into a different archetype of masculinity, which is this one where it's like, well, I don't have sex, you know, because like women are dangerous to my masculine energy or something like that, you know, like, as opposed to like ever considering that he might be ace, you know, for example.
Exactly. Yep. And I mean, to me, it reads as something that Krakauer has been agonizing about for years of his own life.
Mm, yeah.
And he's interpreting the behavior of this person that he's never met through a lens of, immense, like maybe over analyzing of the role sex plays in people's lives, the role sex or celibacy plays in his own life, and what that means about this particular, you know, kid that he's turned into a cipher for, men everywhere who want to have experiences in the wild.
Yeah. And I would say also that that's a pretty consistent thing throughout, books like this, including, of course, My Side of the Mountain and Hatchet. Like, there's no sex in the woods. There's like mommy falcons and and Freudian hatchets, but like there's no, I mean, there are kids' books which tend not to talk directly about sex, but there's like no, they're total innocence as far as sex is concerned. They aren't thinking about it at all.
I mean, I think that may be a product to a little bit of when they were written. I mean, I know we see a lot more YA literature now that does address those topics more directly. But I mean, these are teenagers. And I'm curious if there's wilderness stories about teenagers that do talk about sex, because it seems to me like there's a fear of associating sex with time in the woods. Um, and it feels a little homophobic to me. Like,
Mm.
it's like men are in the woods. The woods experience is, how did Krakauer say it? You know, the wilderness is hot and stark and rough. And there seems to be this paranoid fear that if the relationship is sexualized, then the male author writing about the boy in the woods might be suspected to be gay.
Right. If the woods represents masculinity and the sort of wilderness adventure story is in a lot of ways like a sensual sort of body centered story, then there's this sort of worry that the association of these feelings with this place, or with this idea of wildness is also sort of kind of gay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like there's this platonic sense of the way people enter into the woods, I think. In some of these books that speaks to that for me. Um it's like, "Oh, yeah, like me in the woods, like we're best friends. Like there's nothing going on between us, we swear. Like we just hang out, we do bro night, like we play video games together, but that's it." Like there's no secret love that we feel. Like, and you're like, okay, got it.
Right. I'm just trying to have some rough congress with nature, but no homo.
Yeah, rough Congress could mean whatever, right? Like,
Like, it could just mean like tussling, tussling a little bit.
just a little, yeah, just roughing it up. Um, this is totally making me think of how much nature is sexualized in some explicitly openly gay literature and media, and I'm totally thinking of Call Me by Your Name right now. It's just like nature is gay in that movie, and it's much more of a pastoral nature. It's like ponds and farm country, and there's like people entering the water, and there's a scene that involves fruit sex, and it's just very like an example of the idea of nature feeling totally sensual and lustful and sexual just to be in, and it's really gorgeous. Like it's obviously a great example of like how arbitrary it is that nature is like denuded of that aspect in the stuff that we're talking about for this.
Well, I think it's particularly related to the kind of like to the survival narratives that we're talking about, and the idea of the wild, like as opposed to, I mean, there's such a long tradition of like shepherd stories being like very queer, all the way back through the centuries, like shepherds singing love songs to each other, and pastoral poetry as this vehicle for like male friendship in scare quotes. And I think that association, like there's something in there with like domesticity, and that actually I find is one of the things about My Side of the Mountain that makes it really different for me from the other narratives is like, we talked about like the recipes that Sam comes up with and talks about in that book. But there's also like one of the things that has stuck with me my whole life, even after I stopped reading it constantly and sleeping with it under my pillow, but that stuck with me from that book is the scene where Sam, um, it's like winter and he hasn't had anything green for a long time. He's just been like living on like the nuts he stored in his little treehouse, and he kills a rabbit that Frightful caught, and he talks about like how good the liver looks to him. He's just like knows he's just like directly wants to go for this liver. And then he eats it, and the kind of narrative voice is like, I was drawn to the liver because I was vitamin C deficient, right? And that was in the liver, and like that was kind of for me as a kid the first time I like had ever kind of heard that kind of listen to your body language and seen it illustrated, and like the idea of your body knowing what you need. And that was like so powerful for me and stuck with me my whole life as like a kind of example of what it could feel like to like listen to your body and know, which of course, is definitely something that I think is hard for a lot of queer people, trans people, fat people, like generally.
Totally. I mean, that is really reminding me of when we were saying that in Hatchet, there were these things that Brian just knows. And in the context of Hatchet, we were a little dubious that he would just know things the way he does in that story. But I think there's something there that is compelling in these narratives that has to do with nature being an opportunity to listen to your body, because the body is such a dominant presence when you're in a survival situation. And it becomes this incredible site of inquiry and information. And, regardless of whether or not like nature is being narrated in a like no homo kind of way. And I don't like that aspect of these stories. I love the idea of, the concept of being in the wild or an encounter with nature as being like an encounter with the body.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that is one of the really compelling and powerful sort of sites where like I could see, yeah, I could see like queer wilderness education and queer wilderness practice being like really powerful in a queer context, because it can be this like process of bodily attention and like being in place in a more full presence mind body way. But I think that too is kind of particularly threatening to the sort of masculine archetype of wilderness explorer, because like, I mean, I think that's kind of what the sex thing is about. Like, if you're listening to your body in the wilderness, then like, your body could be saying some scary things to you, like that it has desires, and that it, and that it's not entirely under your control, and that you're not just a free individual with total control over everything around you.
Yeah, I mean, I see so much of that in Into the Wild, which clearly to me there was this aspect of sensory and physical denial that was part of the way Chris McCandless was going around on these adventures. And I see that because I get the impression that when he was going on this journey and traveling around and hitchhiking, it seems like he was gradually starving.
Yeah.
Um, and there are moments when it talks about, he said he could live on a 25-pound bag of rice for weeks or whatever, and he only took rice with him when he went to Alaska. And he was gradually losing weight and starving before whatever that was the incident of poisoning that Krakauer says finally was the what led to his death.
Yeah.
And like for me, I mean, that is like such a thing of trying to have control over the body, by trying to be able to cope with a feeling of hunger all the time and denying his body nourishment and sensory pleasure and being, confident in this sort of like like food celibacy, which like I would not want to live on a bag of rice.
No, there's only so far you can go on. Yeah, I mean, I think that that sounds entirely like a legit reading that he's gradually starving himself before he gets to Alaska. And the thing about this character, at least, the person that I feel like I read between the lines of what Krakauer is trying to do is a person who wants his relationship to the world to be one of like giving, right? But also wants complete control. So,
Yeah.
and, coming out of white patriarchal heterosexist culture, that makes complete sense to be like in that kind of bind because they're really, I think it goes back to this problem of like, he's trying to get outside of something that he can't see yet. Like, he doesn't see that there is this heteronormative structure that he's trapped inside, and this capitalist structure too. He doesn't see that he's like constantly asking for transactional relationships. And I mean, even those passages where it's describing him like going to going to 14th Street in Washington D.C. in the 1980s, which was really hard hit by the crack epidemic, like so many other American cities, and walking around and like talking to sex workers and drug addicts about like how they can change their lives and better themselves. And it's this totally gag worthy image, right, of this like rich white boy from Alexandria walking around 14th Street being like, let me give you some advice. Like,
Yeah.
and you can just imagine all these people like humoring him. But I mean, it's the whole white savior complex, right? Which is the same process of like, I can be giving, but only in the context of me having all of the control and all of the power.
I know.
And it's just like, ugh, sorry, buddy, but that's not liberation. That's not going to get you like to the better world that you're imagining when you're like thinking of yourself as some kind of revolutionary hero. Like, you're not going to get there by keeping yourself separate from people and getting to like keep all the control in every interaction. And I think that's part of what makes this book feel tragic to me, in spite of some of the ways that it feels like such a stereotypical story of like hubris and entitlement. I think is this sense that he is trying to get liberated. It's just like a classic example of you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Like, you can't dismantle your entrenchment in a system that wants you to grow up and be a lawyer and make money and get married like your dad with the tools of your dad of controlling people and controlling relationships and denying your body.
Yeah, it's tragic and it is a death trap and there's many feelings. And one of the feelings I think that we were wrestling with too is that there are aspects of a story like that I think are appealing to transmasculine folks. And
Yeah.
there are elements of masculinity that get into realms of toxic masculinity that are magnetic for folks that feel masculine. And
Yeah.
I think that part of what we're talking about here is things that we have been drawn to at various times in our lives, like independence, self determination, self sufficiency, discipline, having control over the narrative, like of what your body is and what it can do. There have been times when I've been like, I live my life staring into the computer, and this imaginary world I live in has so much power over me, and I resist that. I resent that, and I want to know that my life belongs to me, and I want to aspire to some of the ideals of masculinity that I don't think are toxic. But then I need to understand what I think is toxic and what I think is not. And I think that there's this complicated hash of stuff in any story like this where along the way to the death trap that's sort of lying there at the end, we can see that there are aspects of masculinity that are not violent. And
Yeah.
those are the aspects of masculinity that I think that magnetize me. And it makes the relationship you have with a story like this as a transmasculine person really complicated because it's not a black and white. It's not a binary of like hate all men, hate everything about masculinity. Masculinity is the problem. Toxic masculinity is the problem. And we're teasing out where it becomes a threat to the community and a threat to this particular person who died.
I think that's such an important point to make. And I think that another place this connects is just the recognition that like the death trap, like the trap is in service of something else. I think one of the things that has become really clear through these conversations we've had about these books is like in American culture, we project our desires onto the wilderness. Like this is a space where we like to imagine that we could get what we want. And I think that goes all the way back to white folks sailing on boats from Europe, thinking that they're finally going to get to own some land and totally ignoring that that means genocide already for the people who are there. Just thinking about like how their family has been, powerless renters on some lord's land that's belonged to him for as long as anyone can remember and thinking about getting theirs, right? And I think that like thing of projecting your desires and the things that you want onto the wilderness goes all the way from there to now. And I do think this is where it kind of comes back and connects to what happened on January 6th, which was this mob of Trump supporters storming the US Capitol, because they're talking about as if they're storming it in defense of freedom and liberty and whatever, and what they're storming it in defense of is this pretense, the myth that they have the right to come and get theirs.
Yeah. There's a cluster of related things there. But what I'm thinking about is how that desire projection seems part of how an unorganized mob could all end up in this rioting situation together. Because I think that there's this promise of change or transformation or this like peak moment, and because the nature of this particular attack was kind of distributed and it was this, created on social media kind of thing happening through all these different channels and like different groups kind of coming together, there is this like sense of like, we're going to like have an apocalypse and these desires for all of these things that I need as a human being are going to be fulfilled by this moment of chaos.
So I think this sort of like inability to accept that you're not always in control, the winner, the dominant, is really like as a sort of figure. It's like the myth. I think we see in Christopher McCandless as a person who dies from his attempt to fulfill this myth. John Krakauer comes along, and I think one of the things we've really come to in this conversation, like trying to tease apart Christopher McCandless and John Krakauer, like Krakauer is not all that interested in McCandless as a person. He's interested in like patching up and repairing the myth that he thinks McCandless stands for. That's his project here, is like making McCandless look like fit better into the mold of like this, white masculine survivor guy. I mean, that's what the book is kind of working on. And I think that's infuriating, and it continues to be infuriating, and we continue to come up against this choice of like, do we just patch the myth up? Do we just try and like make it fit, or do we like acknowledge that this is a death trap and like that like there are many beautiful things about masculinity that we would love to do, but it does not have to hold us hostage and murder us. Like we don't have to let it do that.
I hear you saying that, and I'm like, it's just so absurd that anyone would participate in that because they're patching up their own doom. And I just think about like, why would anyone like bolster up something that's dooming them to this awful fate? And of course, I think about sometimes different kinds of fates of folks who are toxically masculine. And I think that one of the most common ones is isolation and loneliness.
Yeah.
And I think, why would you ever voluntarily build a myth that resulted in you being isolated from humanity? But you would have to be able to see that there was a life for you on the other side of that and not feel scared that there is total annihilation if this myth dies.
Right. And I think that means recognizing it as a myth, of course. Like, if you think it's your actual body, then you're a lot more likely to try and patch it up at any cost. And I think I
Yeah.
think that is, for me, one of the many joys of being a trans masculine person is like, I don't feel like I'm as in danger personally. I mean, I know that there are a lot of other intersecting reasons for that too, but like, I don't feel as in danger of like thinking that's my body. Although at different moments in my life, like some parts of it have felt compelling. Like, should I have fewer feelings? Should I be the breadwinner in my house even though I'm like an artist, and nobody's gonna pay me for this? Like,
You're like, "Should I be a gruff breadwinner?
yeah,
Is that what my gender is?"
rougher, breadier, winnier.
No, I feel that. I've had those moments. I mean, I don't know, just like, should I be meaner? Like, and it's just so insane to think that, but it is this sort of like aspirational thing of like kind of wishing that you were like more masculine and that like masculinity is intimidating. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
why do I have that in my head?
I think because of coming from a subject position where it's a little bit easier to see the like bullshit of the myth, like, and the fact that it's like rotting and falling apart. Like, when I think about whiteness as a myth, I'm sure that at many moments in my life I am unconsciously doing patch jobs on that, or like I
Mhm.
catch myself doing patch jobs on it and I'm like, God damn it. Like,
Yeah,
or like the systems of my life are built to continually be participating in the patching. Like, it's just
absolutely.
to just acknowledge that these things are built into the structure of our culture and our economic systems and everything about how we live, which can make it, as to like why people don't just let it rot. Like, I think that can feel like an existential threat to folks sometimes. Like, I think it can feel end of the worldy.
I've had the feeling before of anticipating annihilation in terms of like
Mm,
an identity crisis when in fact like, you know, I'm in a position where like my body will be fine if this particular situation I'm in, group of friends, job changes. There's that feeling of like terror of what's going to happen afterwards.
yeah,
And I'm definitely not like signing off on that like being an okay reason to perpetuate anything, but more just interested in it as a process and using that information to resist it.
totally. When you say that, my mind kind of goes to this feeling of like wanting to be in space with Black organizers talking about Black organizing right now, like as a way through this fear. It's interesting though, because I feel like, also, I mean, one of the things we've been saying on the podcast, kind of casually almost, like, because I feel like in some communities it's like almost taken for granted at this point that like apocalypses happen all the time. That's like a phrase we've said a bunch of times. I feel like 2016 was the moment at which that concept became mainstream. And the reason for that was because of the reaction of Black people and Indigenous people and many people of color to the election of Donald Trump. There was this sort of like shock and terror that was going through, I think, a lot of white folks, and, myself included, who are moderate or left. I feel like the memories of like white backlash, white violence are so present with Black people in this country that, like, many Black activists like are not shocked and do not feel the rug has been ripped out from under them, or they have suddenly been revealed to be unsafe, because they've already known that, and Indigenous folks have known themselves to be living in the apocalypse this whole time. But I would say that, like, again, as in 2016, like the only moments in the last week when I felt like my like clenched muscle level of panic go down a little bit has been when I've gotten to be in virtual rooms with Black organizers, because I had been volunteering to like call people in Georgia with Surge, before the election in Georgia. And so I, learned about this call with organizers from Georgia who were talking about the victory that also happened on Wednesday there. And like, I don't know how folks are feeling on the inside, but those organizers were definitely contextualizing this moment in like centuries of white mob violence, as backlash to the kinds of changes that have been or that might come out of Black Lives Matter over centuries. So even though it's like super scary and like it is happening, the impacts of people's lives are fucking terrible. But like to bring us back to survival and kind of like what these conversations are about, like the fact of the survival of like Black organizing culture and Black people through that is like the one thing that has made me feel a little bit okay this last week.
Yeah.
I think that that's connected to it because actually like the siege of the Capitol is, it's like, in some ways it's like Christopher McCandless dying in that bus. It's this moment where the myth in all its it's this moment where a person or a group of people take their best shot at making the myth real. You know, freedom, the people's voice, self-sufficiency, and it's shown to be spectacularly violent, self-harming, harming of others. And it's a moment of dissonance between the mythology and the reality of what toxic masculinity, white supremacy is.
Yeah.
So this is a moment of like, we can patch it up. You know, that's where my ambivalence about doing this episode came from. Some kinds of efforts to understand can feel like trying to patch it up.
Yeah.
Or we can be like, look, that is broken. Like, that's what that is. It's this broken thing. And it goes all the way through the way that we have set up our whole system. And I think that because that is like taken for granted, known by Black Lives Matter organizers, that feels like a much stronger place to be thinking about the future from, having acknowledged, like knowing, like we're not going to try and patch this thing up. We're going to do something else.
Yes. And I think that it's important to have conversations of both types, to think about what was and why it was, and then what could be, and what we dream of. And that's very general, and but I think the more you talk about this, the less distant you become from it. And some of these things have rendered it impossible to remain distant. If, every day I realize like that so much is at stake, stuff is at stake for the folks that have been radicalized, and folks died in that mob.
Yeah.
Some of the folks who died in the mob were the radicals, and that is a tragedy also. Like I don't I don't prefer that people die. And
Yeah.
it's
Or waste their lives pursuing, with all of the fervor that they have to give to the world, pursuing some bullshit. It's just too bad. It You know what my wife reminded me of when we were talking about this the other day? Like, the Capitol siege is this kind of moment of dissonance between mythology and reality, is one of my favorite pop culture moments of my adulthood, which was the moment when the pop star Britney Spears shaved off all her golden hair and took a baseball bat, I think it was, to her boyfriend's car. And I just remember seeing that on the news and feeling absolute elation, because I was a teenager when Britney Spears was like at the height, and I was like a fat queer butch teenager, and she just like felt like that icon of like this femininity that was being foisted on me, and was just kind of like icon of objectification, like women not having agency over the things that they do in the world. And like when she was like, I'm going to shave off my head and take a baseball bat to this car, and y'all are just going to have to see what this does to people. I was just like, yes, yes, do it. Thank you. Thank you for being who you are.
were you like, work, bitch?
Yes. So I can never, I'd like, it is completely rewritten Britney in my heart. Like, she does not make me feel bad anymore. She makes me feel good.
Well, it's like, how do you relate with a myth?
Yeah, with a baseball bat, I guess.
Just break it up,
Yeah.
smash it.
And that's what I want for us. You know, I want us all to like take a metaphorical baseball bat to the like boyfriend's car of toxic masculinity and
We'll be like, we'll be hitting toxic masculinity. Don't you know that you're toxic?
Oh wow. Oh wow.
My like Britney Spears song references have now been exhausted. So this has been Queers at the End of the World.
Next time on Queers at the End of the World, join us in 2 weeks for a conversation with poet, librarian, and educator Allison Rollins as we talk about nature, survival, and her 10-day wilderness course in the Arizona desert, where she had to survive with nothing but a bundle of reeds and a reality TV star. And in between now and then, don't forget to check out our Patreon and our new short feature coming to you next week, Queers at the End of the World presents.
Our show art is by the fabulous Ellie Yanagasawa, who you can find for your own commission at Ellie the Cosmic Jelly. The music for this episode was La Fin des Haricots by Tintamare. You can find us at queerworlds.com or at Queer Podcast on Instagram.
If you enjoyed the show, we would really, really appreciate it if you'd rate and review us. It helps people find us, and it lets us know that you're out there listening.
And tell a friend who you think will enjoy it. That's by far the best way for folks to find out about the podcast.
Part of the point of all this is for us to talk to our community, so we'd love to hear back from you. If you're a queer person making apocalyptic and dystopian media, and you have something you'd like us to read, watch, play, or listen to, or you just have a great idea for a topic we should cover on the show, get in touch with us at queerworldspodcast@gmail.com. Alright, good luck out there, dear hearts.
Dude. No, hang on. He spent a night in custody before being stirred by the dark mystery of mortality. Like not a few of those seduced by the wild, McCandless was a natural. He headed to the crags at every opportunity, blubbered, screaming obscenities until he grew hoarse, trying to slip into the country without ID, cranking out 400 push-ups every day, and walking 2.5 miles to school.
He may have been tempted by the succor offered by women, but it paled beside the prospect of a handgun.